Hi everyone, welcome to Russia on the Record, the new podcast from the Moscow Times. In this podcast, we will reflect, analyze, and explain what's going on in Russia right now. In our first episode, we will discuss the local and regional elections in Russia, which ended on Sunday. These elections have unofficially kicked off a new election cycle, which will culminate with the presidential elections next March. Joining us are researcher Andras Toth-Czifra and MT journalist Pyotr Kozlov, who will discuss and analyze the September election results and look at what we can expect from the coming election season. From the international point of view, these elections in Russia don't seem to be very important. But from the point of view of the internal politics, do you agree that those municipal and regional elections were probably one of rare elections where concurrence is still possible in Russia? Andras, probably you will start.
When we talk about competition, right, yes, I agree that there were elections that took place last week where competition did exist, and we have seen opposition successes. Well, what we call opposition successes in certain isolated pockets and on certain levels. But if you look at the process itself, we compare these elections to last year's elections or especially the elections in, say, 2020 or even 2018, when most of these regions last held elections, then we have to observe that the space of competition has been shrinking. And in a way, these opposition successes or these competitive campaigns that we have seen here and there, for instance, in Khakassia, where even though the United Russia candidate for governor, Sergei Sokol, withdrew before the election, just the fact that we had a fairly competitive campaign that resulted in a situation in which Sokol thought it was the better decision to withdraw, it is itself notable. And then we have seen opposition successes in certain cities. We have seen, for instance, the Yabloko party get into 4 city dumas across the country, specifically in cities mostly that have had a tradition, a history of more pluralistic politics. But nonetheless, this means that there are still pockets in Russian politics that are not fully controlled by the Kremlin, or where the opposition politics can still work, because it would be perhaps more risky to completely extinguish it than to leave them be and let them compete and occasionally even win elections. So I think this itself is notable mostly because of the significant increase in domestic repression that we have seen over the past couple of years. So if we are talking about these elections and the domestic significance of these elections, I would say that perhaps one of the takeaways is that there are still campaigns, there are still regions, there are still cities in which competitive politics is, if not thriving, but at least possible at a base level. And there are still issues that let, for instance, the so-called systemic opposition align itself with activists. We have seen activists who campaigned, for instance, on environmental issues, ally themselves with systemic opposition parties and win seats. So these obviously are not going to be earth-shattering for Russian domestic politics as a whole. But it lets us note that the situation is not completely authoritarian, in the sense that there are still pockets of political competition.
Yeah, I will just remind you, our listeners, the case of Khakassia, where the candidate from the United Russia withdrew from the elections because of his, problems with health. But those were one of the concurrential elections in Russian regions, where the candidate of United Russia was challenging the governor, actually, from the Communist Party. And so after the withdrawal of the United Russia candidate, there was no intrigue anymore. And so the elections were won by the governor of the Communist Party.
Just to add something to the topic of the Communist Party, as I think if we look at the bigger picture, on the other hand, we can also conclude that following these elections, domestic politics as a whole has become significantly less competitive. So, for instance, if you look at exactly the Communist Party's results, obviously Khakassia is an outlier because there, United Russia and the authorities did not have complete control over how the local institutions and how the elections were administered. But in many other regions, you see a complete collapse of the Communist Party's vote in regional legislative elections or municipal elections or gubernatorial elections. And this is significant because the Communist Party over the past couple of years has developed a regional activist base in many regions. And just by virtue of its being the second biggest party and the strongest opposition party, it has in many ways become a catch-all opposition party. And I think following these elections, and we can obviously dive into the causes of this later, communist candidates obviously in many regions face significant administrative pressure as well as they were struggling to find campaign themes, but the elections themselves, as I mentioned, were not competitive. So it's difficult to analyze to what extent this would have made a difference. But the fact is that after these elections, the Communist Party certainly was relegated or pushed back into the level of a much tamer opposition party than before. So we have, if you just look at the results, a party that used to score in many regions in the 20s, 30s when it comes to percents, and now it's between 10 and 15 in most regions, which is a much more comfortable result from the point of view of the authorities, because it means that there is no obvious challenger or potential challenger to the primacy of United Russia.
Pyotr, do you agree with this analysis? Do you agree that Communist Party is losing its position in many regions?
What we can say to this particular election campaign, on one hand, as far as the elections are still on the table and they still give Russian politicians and Russian citizens to make some kind of choice, we can say that there is some kind of concurrence. But on the other hand, as we see today in Russia, amid more than 1.5 years of Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war is one of the main and very important issues which actually influences the life of ordinary people, the politicians, the elites on the national level, the same as well as on regional level. But as we see, if we look at those campaigns, which took some time, so no one of the candidates did really articulate the war and the problem which it creates for Russia since end of February 2022. So actually, this is the important issue, of course, and the Institute of Elections in Russia, it still exists, as we see, but can we call it really competitive? I think it's hard to say that. I had a great experience of traveling via Russia years ago. For example, the last time, I think I was in 2021, when I was covering elections in Russian Far East. And when you are on the ground, when you see the campaign, you can see that the struggle on the ground is much more tough than it is somewhere in Moscow, as it was at least some years ago. And now what I see is that even on the ground, even in the regions, when you are a bit far away from the capital, a bit far away from the Kremlin administration and from the officials which are actually assigned to control the elections and to control the campaign. So even in this situation, the opposition candidates, they did not demonstrate really great results. And if we speak about the actual campaigns, for example, in Khakassia, actually this is the only, if we speak about the regional level, the level of the heads of Russian regions or oblasts or federal districts, this is the only result where we can say that even though Kremlin was really planning to change head of this region. It did not manage to. But in general, the results, which demonstrate that the actual percent of the pro-Kremlin candidates or the candidates supported by Kremlin and the ruling United Russia party, they got really huge percent. So it's like the governors, it's like 70%, starting maybe from 60 and until up to like 75 or even 80, especially in the annexed territories. So these numbers look like one of the results of the ongoing military invasion of Ukraine, the censorship, and the other tools which are used by Kremlin to not to let any opposition or any independent voices or any independent candidates to start and to participate in the campaign.
Piotr, you mentioned that no Russian party actually declared its campaign, and neither of the parties spoke about like the reality over the last 18 months of post-war Russia. But still, there was a Yabloko political party that made "for peace" as their actually motto, as their more slogan for the elections. So somehow this rhetoric was there on the elections, wasn't it?
Probably, but when we speak about the war in today's Russia, there are a number of Duma established laws which actually ban any criticism, any discourse criticizing Kremlin, Russian army, and Russian politicians who are taking the decisions concerning the war. So actually, what you mentioned is probably an example of an exclusive and is an example of the rhetoric and the discourse which is trying to be fed to and discussed with the audience, discussed with the Russians, bearing in mind and having all those censorship laws acting. Because we know a lot of people, a lot of like Russian activists, opposition activists, or even opposition politicians. We know Ilya Yashin in Moscow and his colleagues who are actually in prison for more than a year after they started to criticize the war. So it's really very tough to discuss this question today in Russia.
Piotr, you also mentioned the voting on the so-called new Russian territories. And, well, I have a question to Andras. Andras, how do you evaluate, like, the elections in these regions? Was it typical, like, Russian election campaign, or was it even more, like, exaggerated, or, like, there were some particular traits in these regions?
I mean, it is very difficult to analyze these so-called elections in the occupied territories simply because, first of all, they were held illegally, and second, because observers who, even in Russia proper, have faced increased repression and intimidation before and during the regional elections, had even less, if any, access to the votes that were held in the occupied territories. We also know that, according to official results, there was a lot of early voting in these territories. It is difficult to take the officially announced results seriously, especially after last year's quote-unquote referendums on the annexation. So, as far as I'm concerned, I viewed these votes as the Kremlin's sort of answer to Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive. It is a statement that the Kremlin is able to carry out its will in these territories, that it can sort of hold elections, or supposedly it is not ready to give up on these territories. It still wants to integrate them into Russia. And of course, it was also potentially a way for the authorities to make certain adjustments to who holds power and who holds assets in these territories. No doubt, we have seen that the candidates who participated in these votes in the occupied territories included several different local stakeholders, and parliamentary parties did participate in these elections, or at least nominated candidates. But United Russia, according to the official results, at least, has delight in the parliaments of these, in the regional assemblies that will be constructed as a result of these, ostensible elections in these territories. So I would make a very sharp difference between the elections that were held in the occupied territories and the elections that were held in Russia. Of course, within Russia, there are regional varieties, depending on how free and fair and how open the campaigns are between various levels and between various regions. As we have just heard, I completely agree with the analysis that on the regional level, Khakasias was the only competitive campaign. But in the occupied territories, it's difficult to even talk about elections as an institution. Elections can be viewed by voters as well as the authorities in many different ways. They can be viewed as a means of translating a popular will, which of course happens in democracies. But even in authoritarian systems, they can be viewed by voters as a means of sending a message to the authorities to sort of express frustration, to vote against someone or something or a party, which we have seen in Russia in a sort of a less hard authoritarian phase in 2018 in several regions, in the regional elections. But in a region where active warfare is going on and that is held under military occupation, it makes absolutely no sense to even talk about these interpretation of elections. And I think it tells you a lot about why the Kremlin wanted these elections to happen in the occupied region, that first of all, they had to amend electoral legislation to even make them possible. So it was important for them to hold these elections. And that in a district of the Belgorod Oblast in Russia, which borders Ukraine, has suffered shelling over the past couple of months, the elections were postponed, ostensibly because of lack of safety of voters, and yet elections were ostensibly held in the occupied territories where active warfare is going on. So to summarize again, these elections, as far as I can tell, were simply a means for the Kremlin to demonstrate that it controls these territories and it controls the assets in these territories.
It's not the first time that the Russian authorities introduced the electronic vote for the elections. And so this time the elections took place for 3 days and the electronic vote was used in even more regions than before. How does this electronic vote influence the result of the elections? Are there any publications or statistics made about this? Any analysis?
First of all, we need to make a distinction between two electronic voting systems, right? Like there's one in Moscow and there's one in the rest of Russia. And the elections that were held over the past weekend were significant because this electronic voting or online voting was extended to 24 regions plus Moscow. And that was the largest number of regions that has ever used electronic voting at the same time, which indicates that for the 2024 presidential election, it will likely be extended to more regions. Now, this is nothing new. This has been known for years that the Kremlin has these plans. They have talked about it several times. The question always is whether electronic voting is some kind of a silver bullet or some kind of a kill switch that you can just, turn whenever the elections are not going the way you want them to go, if you are the authorities. And there are conflicting accounts. From Moscow, it was online voting indeed that overturned what seemed to be opposition victories in the capital. And then online voting was analyzed by several experts, and there was a large public debate within Russia about the safety and the transparency of online voting. And basically the outcome of it was that it is very difficult for observers to access this system, and it is very difficult for voters to comprehend this system. And due to the many, let's call them glitches, but obviously sometimes these glitches appear very suspicious, there's not a very strong case for voters to trust this online voting system. Now, this was in Moscow, and this was the rest of Russia. Now, again, one of the distinctions that we need to make is that in Moscow, 80% of voters used electronic voting in this particular mayoral election that took place last week. Elsewhere, we are talking about more like in the 12-15% mark. So it has different weights in different regions. It can still make a difference if, for instance, those votes are manipulated or tampered with or in any way compromised, or just if there's a passive effect, because if you are a voter and you cannot be completely sure that your name cannot be associated with your vote, as if you vote by paper ballot, of course, in the ideal case, the vote is anonymous. In the case of an online voting, which happens through the Gazuslugi portal, if you are unable to verify that your vote is safe and anonymous, and I think in the case of Russia, there is a lot of suspicion, justifiably, that this is not the case, then that can, even without any overt manipulation, that can have a sort of damping effect on, like, you will be concerned and you are more likely to say, well, then I better vote for whoever the authorities want me to vote for, right? So this is extremely difficult to analyze, this effect. So I'm just saying that this is a plausible effect. We don't know to what extent this has made a difference. But what we do know is that there was a lot of administrative pressure on voters to sign up for online voting, and that there were glitches, again, in several regions. For instance, in the Nenets autonomous district, where the system experienced outages, or in Novosibirsk, where specifically the system reportedly didn't let people vote for the communist gubernatorial candidate for a while. So, which do not elicit a lot of trust, because, again, we can say that these are all glitches, and they might very well be, but they suggest purposeful manipulation in the sense that these are both regions where the opposition has traditionally been strong. So what I would say is that online voting is not a kill switch, but what it does is that it allows the authorities potentially to exert the same kinds of pressure that they had offline on voters, but in a more effective and easier way, because you don't have to rely on public officials, factory managers, what have you, who were usually the agents who put pressure on the people whom they oversaw. So in this sense, yes, it is significant. We don't know to what extent, if at any extent, online voting changed the outcome in Moscow this time, because the voting patterns online and offline were indeed fairly similar, but there was also no real competition in Moscow's mayoral elections. And in the regions, well, what I think mattered more than online voting, which certainly also mattered, but I think what mattered more was in the legislative elections, was the single mandate districts that United Russia could use to sort of win large majorities, even in regions where the party itself is not particularly strong.
Pyotr, what can you say about the online voting?
First of all, I agree with our colleague. And what I would like to add is that it's important to know and to bear in mind that there is a huge problem of turnout in elections. And as lower the level of election is, I mean, if the municipal election or something like that, the lower turnout is. The biggest turnout is traditionally the presidential elections and the Duma elections, the Russian National Parliament. So actually, what we can see and what we can try to compare, it's obvious that we cannot do some kind of like direct conclusions, but anyway, if we look at 2018 elections in Moscow, mayor of Moscow elections, the turnout was 30.9% of Muscovites. There was no electronic voting in 2018. What we can see now is that the turnout it was more than 41%, according to the Russian Central Election Commission. And as far as we understand, according to the Election Commission information, so more than 34% of the voters in these elections were those who participated in electronic voting. So what we can see is that electronic voting presumably can affect the turnout for the Russian authorities. And what is important, that the turnout for Kremlin is a very important issue. As far as we know from the publications of Russian independent media, the Kremlin is planning to make the record elections for Vladimir Putin in the next year, in March 2024. And according to Medusa, which published its story concerning the elections, the sources told Medusa that the Kremlin and the officials who actually are assigned with the internal politics is the Sergei Kirienko, the first deputy chief of presidential administration. They're planning to make a record both in percent and the turnout and the actual votes for Putin. We should mention that Putin still hasn't announced his participation in presidential elections, but most of the experts and observers say that he's the candidate who is going to re-elect for the 5th term from the Kremlin, from the Russian authorities. So their plan is to show the record support of President Putin, and the elections in 2023, these autumn elections, concerning the electronic election and the other tools of organizing the elections in different regions, it's a kind of a rehearsal for the Kremlin to see how it all works during the military campaign and Russian invasion in Ukraine is going on. Because as we all see and as we understand, the Kremlin and President Putin himself is, of course, worried about his personal image and personal support, and which was shown, for example, in the last autumn mobilization, which was quite turbulent for the authorities in the meaning of the reaction of the society. So they're trying to guarantee the future results of President Putin and to show him that today, even in the regional elections, the municipal elections and gubernatorial elections which took place this September, so there is a big support for the course of President Putin. And so it shall not be a surprise for the Russian society that such a huge numbers probably and supposedly are going to be for the President Putin in March. So this is what I see.
Putin said recently on the Eastern Economic Forum that he is not officially yet presenting himself for the elections and will need to wait for the date of the elections to be announced. So after the announcement of the date, he said he will think if he's going to run the elections or not. But on your impressions, has the election campaign already started? Because we see Putin being very visible, going to many Russian regions, like to Dagestan, to Kursk region. Probably we can say that the presidential election campaign has already started in Russia.
Well, I think that we obviously see that the presidential campaign has already started. Probably it had too early start after the Prigozhin's mutiny, which took place, which happened in summer. So President Putin is trying to demonstrate the popular support. So he is traveling a lot, he is doing a lot of PR actions. His administration and his aides are organizing to him quite often, and quite lately they started to do that. The meetings, his personal meeting with Russian people who are living in different cities or even villages, which President Putin is visiting for his presidential purposes, and showing the popular support with all the news bulletins showing these pictures, the people cheering him and shouting and telling him, thank you for your work. So I think it's obvious that the campaign has started. And concerning the official start of the campaign, so President Putin, he chooses always this kind of campaign when he is being asked many times by different people, different professions, the politicians, workers from or constructors from different Russian cities and towns, have you already decided yet? Or maybe could you run for presidency? We want you to be presidents more. So it's a traditional trick which he is using, and probably we all know that what will he decide, but up to now he is like playing this game, and as far as I understand, we shall wait. We'll have to wait until December when the Russian Central Election Commission officially announces the campaign, and it usually takes place ahead of a couple of 3 or 4 months ahead of the elections.
Yes, I also agree that I see really no scenario in which Putin decides himself that he's not going to run, he will step back. That may have been an option 2 years ago, when it might have seemed still that the legacy that he was building was one rather of like building and not conquest. And now I think as long as the war is going on, and as long as there isn't anything that can convincingly and confidently sold as a victory, not only to the domestic population, but also to domestic elites, he is going to try to stay in power. I think all of us have seen speculations about Putin potentially being sidelined by the elites. I don't believe that this possibility has a lot of chances for the time being, not after the response that was given to the Prigozhin mutiny. But I don't want to speculate about this, so let's leave this aside and just say that I do expect Putin to soon announce that he is running, and that the 2024 presidential election, from the Kremlin's point of view, will have to be a sort of a ringing endorsement of not just him, but also the war agenda. And now, when it comes to whether the campaign has started or not, and what the Kremlin is looking at when it sort of faces this presidential campaign in a couple of months. So it is obviously hard to ignore the issue, because it has been the main issue for the past years, whether or not Putin is going to run in 2024. It has been present. And yes, he, especially since the mutiny, he has been sort of trying to show that he still has popular support. I guess that he has no alternative, not just for voters, but also for the elite, that anyone else would be worse, because change would result in domestic chaos, or it would result in capitulation. And we have also seen that the security services have been eliminating the ultra patriots who, not perhaps personally, although there are questions about Girkin, but through their agenda pose a sort of right-wing critique, or a hardline critique to Putin that many thought was potentially dangerous. And there is a huge difference between regional votes and the presidential elections that sort of limits a little bit to what extent these regional elections can be rehearsals. So the turnout is very important for presidential elections, because it needs to be a grand popular acclamation. For regional votes and for legislative votes especially, turnout, the Kremlin has tried to keep turnout artificially low over the past years, and at the same time making sure that, quote unquote, the right people go out and vote, so their vote counts more. So you can't pull this off in presidential elections. So that is certainly going to be a challenge. And the other challenge is that one takeaway from these regional campaigns for the Kremlin might have been that the positive war agenda, so to say, is not necessarily going to motivate people to go out and win votes. Now, of course, this is probably going to be different. There's a difference between a regional governor campaigning with a positive image of the war and Putin himself campaigning with a positive image of the war. But nonetheless, we have seen that even Kremlin-endorsed candidates try to sort of campaign on themes that were not directly the endorsement of the war in Ukraine. They endorsed it at the basic level, but otherwise they try to focus on other bread-and-butter issues, social support, investments, and so on. So yes, I think the campaign has in a way already started, in the sense that the Kremlin is processing these lessons. But of course, the 6 months is a very long time, and a lot can happen, and there could be turns on this sort of road to Putin's next presidential term.
Before Prigozhin's mutiny, there were many speculations on his possible presidential ambitions. Now, after Prigozhin's death, can we expect any new faces like participating in the presidential election campaign, even formal candidates? Well, at least there will be no Zhirinovsky. What do you expect others to be like the usual Zyuganov, Yavlinsky, or there are any chances to see new faces, new politicians running the presidential election campaign?
I wouldn't like to speculate on who will and who will not run, but we have, of course, all read the Medusa article that mentioned a couple of potential names to be running against, or as far as Putin in 2024. And I think the main argument was that all the candidates have to be boring enough and old enough in order not to be too dangerous to Putin. So as long as the authorities have complete control over the administrative resources, namely the institutions that govern elections, they're not going to let anyone, even like Pavel Grudinin, who ran in 2018 as a candidate of the Communist Party and was able to mount a surprisingly vigorous campaign. It didn't really seem dangerous to Putin's electoral chances, of course. It's just that it was probably more dynamic than Putin wanted it to be. And that's not a risk, I think, that they are going to be taking with anyone next year. You mentioned LDPR, a thing from that party. Its new leader, Leonid Slutsky, is just a perfect opposition politician that the Kremlin wants to see. And the kind of politician of which we have seen many in gubernatorial elections, actually, across the country over the past weeks in the campaign as well as the elections, who has some kind of name recognition and is able to organize a campaign, but is not going to be in any way as charismatic, as critical of anything that might make people think that Putin is perhaps not the best candidate. It's not going to sort of mobilize protest voting, basically. And as we have seen, for instance, in the Altai territory, where the local Communist Party tried to nominate an actually well-known opposition politician in the region to run against the territory's governor, Viktor Tomenko, that candidate was not allowed to stand. The United Russia used means, specifically the so-called municipal filter, to keep that candidate off the ballot. So that is the level of risk tolerance that I see in the authorities at this point. Therefore, I don't expect, I don't want to, repeat what the Medusa article said, but it seemed to be completely plausible to me that we would see most of the same old faces, even, or some kind of new iteration of the same old faces, but no one really radically new, not even to the extent radically new that Grudinin was in 2018.
Yeah, I think the ideal sparring partner was Ksenia Sobchak in 2018. And I agree with Andras, what he has said, but I would like to add only that the story and the case with Grudinin, as far as I understand, it was found to be a big mistake by Kremlin afterwards, because we remember that on one hand, he was not really a famous person, so he had some popularity, but it was really not national level or even not a Moscow level. But in the end, he started to be, or at least regarded by Kremlin, by Putin's political consultants, as a threat. So he was under a huge pressure in 2018, even though at some point he even stopped to do an active campaign. But even after the elections already passed, so he was under a attack by Russian courts, having some suits against him, and afterwards, I think he has completely disappeared from national level. I think no ordinary people, even journalists, would not answer you really quickly. What is he doing now? Where is he? So we know that he is raising berries in his kolkhoz, kolkhoz imeni Lenin, in close to Moscow, but he has just disappeared. And as far as we understand, he was a sparring partner which was agreed by the Kremlin and the Communist Party, by the Zyuganov team. But as a technical candidate, it is called in Russia, so he was not really pretending to be a new president, but he was found as a threat, and he was under huge attack. So probably this year the Kremlin is trying to find some new faces, but bearing in mind the case of Grudinin, and from this case the conclusion must have been drawn by the Kremlin.
As we learned, Putin will most probably announce his participation in the election in December. Do you think there are risks that, in autumn, there will be new wave of mobilization, so it will pass before Putin will start running his presidential campaign? I know we'll speculate on these mobilization rumors, but what are your analysis?
We know, and the Kremlin definitely also knows, remembers what the reaction to mobilization was last year and how that impacted Russians' perception of the war. And in a way, mobilization has continued in the sense that in many regions we see covert mobilization, governors or in certain cases companies recruiting people to fight, to creating private military companies and so on. But there has not been a new wave of overt mobilization. And it seems very simple to say that because it's a huge political risk and the Kremlin is so sensitive to how the war is perceived, and it should not turn into sort of a popular case against the war and against Putin by extension, who in a sense personifies this war, that it makes absolutely no sense from a political point of view to order a new mobilization. On the other hand, this is obviously not so simple, because the other variable that matters is the situation on the ground in Ukraine. So we will have to see how the Ukrainian counteroffensive progresses and what arguments that gives to proponents of a second wave of mobilization.
Well, I would add that from my point of view, the Kremlin is trying just to balance the need for the reinforcement on the front lines on one hand, and on the other hand is Putin's political vulnerability to a new wave of mobilization. It's obvious that Putin's campaign and Putin's next re-election for the fifth term depends both at the same time at the situation on the ground, on the front line in Ukraine, and at the same time at the situation in Russia, in Russian cities and villages, and the perception of Russians, of Putin as a leader who is capable, on one hand, to defend the country, but on the other hand, as he promised, to give the people ability to live their normal lives and not to attract them to the war. To my mind, the Kremlin is keeping a close eye on the situation and will react on what's happening on the front lines, because they have always make a choice between not making Russians to feel that the war is becoming total for the Russian population. But on the other side is the risk of losing to the Ukrainian army and being forced to leave the territories which were already, according to Kremlin, were annexed. I mean, the occupied territories of southern and eastern Ukraine. We remember the situation with the Kherson, which is actually today on the paper is Russian town, and Russia is having elections there, but at the same time on the ground and in reality it's under Ukraine's control, and Russia has nothing to do with those territories and with those people who live there. So it's more symbolic, but it's a blow to Kremlin, and Putin doesn't want to have another blow this kind.
Yeah, we can also see like the political repressions getting harder and new repressive laws being voted in Russia. Do you think there is a chance of like an ice break during the election campaign, or it will also depend on what is going on the front line in Ukraine?
There is no good reason to play actual democracy or actual political competition, especially in presidential elections, beyond what we have mentioned, these very boring and tame sparring partners. And in order to keep it that way in the coming months, especially with so many moving parts, so many questions about what this new normal is going to look like and whose interests are going to be heard, I think there is no good reason for the Kremlin to ease repression around the issues that really matter to it.
I'm also not waiting for any ice breaks or breaking ice in the means of like liberalizing the situation in Russia. What I think is that for the last, let's call it like years, and especially after the beginning of the invasion, the Kremlin has drawn the red lines. We specifically see these lines after the Prigozhin's mutiny. So those red lines are drawn, and anyone who is like inside the lines probably is not going to be repressed or punished. But if anyone decides to cross those lines, it doesn't matter in which direction, like from the liberal side or from the patriotic, ultra-patriotic side, there's obviously going to be another repressions, punishment, jails, etc. So from my point of view, the situation is probably designed to be inside these red lines. The only thing, the only couple of things that could change and make Kremlin to do some changes and to make some changes actively, it will depend on the situation on the front, if it is deteriorating, or the situation in Russian economy, which is very vulnerable to the situation connected to invasion, the sanctions from Western countries. So if the situation in those, either in one of those, the front lines or economy, or like both are going to deteriorate, I think we shall wait for some other repressions, tightening control. So we will wait for making the pressure higher from the government and from the regime. ...2023 and 2024 election campaign from the point of view of journalists or experts or the Russia watcher, it's an interesting process. So we never could imagine that in Putin's Russia there's going to be something like Prigozhin's mutiny and so-called march of probably thousands of armed people and with some like military units to the Moscow. So I guess that it will keep our attention quite tight, and probably we can see something also unexpected during the following months.
Yes, exactly. So what we are talking about here is a baseline scenario. No doubt about the fact that there is a lot that might be going on in the background that we don't see. There are a lot of 6 months are a very long time in these circumstances. 6 months ago, yes, Prigozhin was alive. Had no idea that he would lead a mutiny in just a couple of weeks or months. It is difficult to predictions, and I'm not going to make predictions. What we have discussed here is what if nothing changes, if the situation continues as it looks like now, we have discussed the lessons of the elections that have just taken place. I think it's very important to also highlight the work that many people, journalists, as well as election observers, have done and are doing in Russia on the ground over the past weeks and months to document the ways in which the Kremlin is administering these elections, because that allows us to sort of conclude what they are probably planning to do, and perhaps gives us a little more information about the steps that they might take to get there.